Hello to everybody. We're just opening up the session. If you just give us a couple minutes, we're going to let everybody sign on and then we'll start. Okay, it looks like we have about more people are joining now. Feel free to write in the chat where you're joining us from. Kritika, feel free to get started whenever you'd like. I think we have a good number of people that have joined us.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody for joining us today. My name is Kritika. I'm a project officer at the IORA Secretariat, and I'll be the moderator for this session. Today's webinar will discuss the key findings of the new IORA UN Women report on women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean Rim, progress and challenges, which was launched last month by the IORA Acting Secretary General Dr. Gatit Gunawan and Australia's senior official to IORA, Dr. Kristen Hurst. This webinar is provided under IORA's collaboration with UN Women, supported through a 3-year project funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Here's the agenda for today's webinar. We will kickstart with opening remarks, followed by the report findings, some responses from around the region, after which we will have a Q&A session. The webinar will be recorded, and all who registered for the webinar will receive a link to the recording over the next few days. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the chat box, and we will address them during the Q&A session. I'd now like to invite Ms. Catherine Throumi, Assistant Director at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to deliver the opening remarks. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Kritika, and good morning or good afternoon from Australia. Many thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today virtually. As Kritika mentioned, my name is Catherine Throumi. I'm the Assistant Director in the India and Indian Ocean branch, working in Australia's IORA team in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Today's webinar is a great opportunity to hear from the UN Women about the Women's Economic Empowerment Report, Progresses and Challenges. This is one of the major deliverables from a 3-year partnership between IORA and UN Women. And we were delighted that we could make this possible through funding from the Australian government. The partnership has delivered tangible resources to advance women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean region. And it builds on the previous IORA UN Women reports, signalling that this is a long-standing partnership. Through these partnerships we have had with UN Women, we, the IORA community, have had access to ideas, data, and most importantly, women with experiences on leading businesses. These resources have helped a range of stakeholders develop greater gender equality principles and policies that enable women to have more control over their economic options. This is an important objective for women and for the rest of the economy. We know that by enabling women's rights and economic empowerment, women have better economic options. Women with better economic options deliver better sustainable development outcomes and more inclusive economic growth. The DFAT-funded partnership between IORA and UN Women has been outstanding. Today, we'll hear about key findings for the UN Women report that explores the progress and challenges for women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean Rim. It complements the first report on women's economic empowerment in fisheries, launched by Australia's Foreign Minister and Minister for Women, the Honourable Marise Payne, at the IORA Council of Ministers meeting in December 2020. In addition to collecting and consolidating data to assist understand how to improve women's economic empowerment, UN Women have also arranged a series of webinars like this event that we are participating in today, which includes capacity building workshops and training for IORA member states on relevant topics, including gender responsive procurement, overcoming inequalities through finance and closing the pay gap, supporting women entrepreneurs and women-owned enterprises amid COVID-19, and empowering women in tourism. This webinar will address the findings of the second report on women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean Rim and identifies key opportunities to develop further outcomes that will enhance women's economic growth and empowerment. I commend the work of the UN Women to you, particularly today's reports. I would like to acknowledge the leadership of Ms. Leigh Tomppert and her team at UN Women, who have done an excellent job in delivering the outcomes of our partnership. Working in the wee hours, no pun intended, of the morning to deliver outstanding information and bring people together and share their ideas. I'd also like to thank the IORA Secretariat for their support, in particular, Marc Livsey and Critica. Thank you. And lastly, for the support of the IORA member states, who have arranged impressive speakers and engaged in this very important area that affects all our lives. Through this partnership, we have taken many steps towards better economic outcomes for women across the Indian Ocean, and we look forward to hearing the real stories of women who will benefit. Enjoy today's seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. The Secretariat and IORA are very grateful for Australia's support for this program. In fact, the report that we are talking about today is one of the many tangible research reports and capacity building initiatives that promotes women economic empowerment in the region. So for anyone interested in the full list of activities, please refer to the IORA UN Women project page on the IORA website. I'll leave the link in the chat box below. I'd now like to invite Ms. Leigh Tomppert, who is the UN Women Coordinator of the DFAT supported project on promoting women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean Rim. Leigh has worked with UN Women and its predecessor agency, the UN International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women since 2008, and has worked in UN Women headquarters, the regional office of the Arab states in Cairo, and the country offices in UN Women Georgia and UN Women Ukraine. Leigh also contributed to the editing and coordination of the report we are discussing today. Over to you, Leigh.
Thank you, Critica. I'm just going to share my screen now, hopefully successfully. And just bear with me for a moment. Okay, can you see that okay? Okay. Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Critica. Thanks, Catherine, Marc. It's good to see everyone. The comment about good morning, good afternoon, and specifically good evening is in reference to me. I'm joining you from New York, where it's after 3 o'clock in the morning. I realize we're also having some technical difficulties, so I hope that mine has a steady connection and doesn't break up. But the challenges on my end are I have a 1.5-year-old who has not gone to sleep yet either. So I hope that she will be a good webinar participant and not disturb us as well, but apologies in advance if this is the case. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share some of the main findings of our report today. And I'm also really grateful to DFAT and the IORA Secretariat for our continued partnership in this project. The report that we're discussing today, I think it might have been mentioned already, but this is a follow-up to our 2015 report, which you'll see on the left there, Enabling Women's Contributions to the Indian Ocean Rim Economies. This actually provided a baseline for future monitoring of progress on advancing women's economic empowerment in the region. And if I use the term we, I'm pretty sure everyone knows that I'm referring to women's economic empowerment. And if I don't use the term we, I think this presentation might be twice as long as intended. So just to let you know. The 2020 report, we in the Indian Ocean Rim Progress and Challenges. As Catherine mentioned, it's one of the outcomes of our 3-year partnership with DFAT and IORA. And it was produced basically to provide IORA member states with updated data and analysis to support their ongoing commitments to gender equality. They've had a number of declarations, and these were reiterated in 2018 through the Balaclava Declaration on We and Gender Equality as a prerequisite for sustainable development. So basically this report is to support them, trying to fill in some of the data gaps and provide them a little bit more information of what the status of We is in the IORA region today. So this report was actually written in collaboration with the International Center for Research on Women, or ICRW, and the research findings were reviewed and validated during a research validation workshop that we had in Durban with members of the IORA Working Group on We, as well as representatives of academia and chambers of commerce. And all of the participants in the workshop were very active, and many of them even followed up with some case studies that we integrated into the report. So we're proud that it does reflect, I think, a number of case studies that are good examples that we can follow in the region. This report was officially launched, as Catherine mentioned, during the meeting of IORA's Committee of Senior Officials in June of 2021. But I just wanted to mention before sharing the report's findings, the preparation of this report was actually conducted prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that this pandemic has had global implications for women and girls in particular, including in the Indian Ocean region. Many of the impacts of the pandemic have deepened inequalities. We're seeing increased violence against women, unfortunately, increased women's income insecurity and unemployment, intensified unpaid care work, and basically our health, social security, and care systems are strained to the brink. So it's important to remember, however, though, that the root of these gender gaps still needs to be addressed, even though they're now exacerbated. The root issues are addressed in this report and in its findings and recommendations. It's also important to consider that the pandemic is giving us an opportunity in many areas to build back better and create a more gender equal region. So just to keep this in mind when we're talking about the report's results, or you're reading them and you're reading the recommendations, because they're even more pertinent and urgent now.
This one.
Mm-hmm.
This one.
Just to provide you with some background on our 2020 report, the conceptual framework is built around Naila Kabir's work, which defines empowerment as an expansion of, as an expansion in people's ability to make strategic life choices, where this ability was previously denied them. So Kabir suggested that the changes in this ability to exercise choice involve 3 interdependent dimensions. I think you're gonna have to take her downstairs. Okay. Resources, which can be material, social, or human, agency, including collective as well as individual reflection and action, and achievements. So this report basically uses these 3 dimensions to examine the investments and opportunities that exist and have been created in the Indian Ocean Rim region to further foster women's economic empowerment. Sorry for the interruptions. Unfortunately, this is not the first webinar that this has happened. So this slide actually shows some of the key indicators that we selected to examine women's economic empowerment in labor markets and in women's political participation, as well as economic leadership in the region. So in terms of resources, the report highlights how policies and investments to expand women's access to these specific resources can advance their economic empowerment in the region. So unfortunately, we have pretty limited time for our webinar today. I'm not going to be able to cover the results of all of these different factors, but we've selected them because they're basically vital resources to we, particularly also in the Indian Ocean region. And then we looked at agency And in terms of examining agency and collective voice in the region, we looked at the status of women's roles in decision-making in both political and economic forums and organizations. And then the section on measuring achievements looks at the impact of policies and initiatives on we through 3 metrics. We chose the SIGI, which is the Social Institutions and Gender Index, Human Development Index, and the Gender Development Index. So we're hoping that these will help shine some light on both short-term and long-term trends. So actually this screenshot is of the infographic that we created, where we have a lot of the data that summarizes some of the key issues. When I'm finished with my presentation, I'm going to put the hyperlink to this infographic, and I hope you'll take a look at it. So basically the report also looks at the status of women in the economy, looking at various issues such as women's labor force participation, informal work, their representation in different labor sectors such as agriculture, services, and manufacturing, all in the region, gender pay gaps, women's entrepreneurship, unpaid care work, migration, and the impact of conflict on we. So these, as I mentioned, this infographic actually, wherever possible, provides the baseline data from the 2015 report, and you can toggle between 2015 and 2020 to basically look at the trends, whether or not there's been any improvements, advancements, or regressions. So I'm just going to share with you very briefly some of the data and key findings that are highlighted in both the infographic and in the report. So this graph illustrates the differences in labor force participation between women and men. Of course, the IORA region we have to consider is extremely diverse with both developing and advanced economies. However, we really do see that in both developed and developing countries, women continue to have a much lower rate of labor force participation than men. The countries on the left there are those with the biggest gender gaps in labor force participation, and also coincidentally happen to have some of the lowest labor force participation among women. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we see countries like Madagascar, where it's 84% of women participate in the labor force and the gender gap is just 5%. And then in Mozambique, this gap is only 2%. And I apologize if it's not that easy to read the chart, but please keep in mind that this is a screenshot from the infographic. So when you go to the infographic, it's actually interactive. And when you use your cursor and you go over the data, you'll see the specific data points for each country. And just to kind of provide you with a positive note, women's labor force participation on the whole in the region has shown a modest increase in a majority of IORA countries over the last decade. This graph, as you can see by the number of the countries, it reveals that there's very limited data on the topic of unpaid care and domestic work. But this is such a critical issue for we. Unpaid care and domestic work supports the economy and often makes up for the lack of public expenditure on social services and infrastructure. But this work globally remains disproportionately feminized around the world. This data that you see, I believe it's 10 countries. This is data from the UN Statistical Division time use database that we included in the report. It looks at the number of hours dedicated to paid and subsistence work compared to unpaid domestic care and volunteer work. So just to note that the figures for Malaysia are only include unpaid work. So if you look at the graph, the green columns represent men and the blue represents women. The full column is the total hours worked by both men and women, while the shaded area shows how much of this work is actually unpaid. So for example, if you look at Mauritius, women work a total of 6.6 hours a day, with 4.6 hours of that time unpaid, while men work a total of 6.2 hours, which includes just 1.2 hours of unpaid work. So of the 10 IORA countries with data, women perform on average 3 more hours per day of unpaid care and domestic work than men. And in all countries but one, women perform more hours of total work than men. So unpaid care work is a major barrier preventing women from entering and advancing in the labor force. This is a key finding that you'll find in almost any WE report these days. And the report calls for each IORA member state to create policies to support men and women to reduce and redistribute this unpaid care and domestic work and increase women's ability to earn and learn. Obviously, it's very important that we would fill the data gap on this issue as well. More time use surveys would be extremely helpful. And this slide, basically examining issues of agency through women's leadership in business. The report highlighted that no country in the region has reached gender parity in management. On average, women occupy about a quarter of management positions. There's a broad range, however, as you can see in the graph in the IORA region. Actually in Seychelles, it's close to parity at 47.8%, but it's still less than 5% in Yemen. So it's a broad range of efforts that still need to be made. Evidence shows that firms that diversify their top leadership to include more women can expand their networks, increase legitimacy, and improve decision-making. I'm hoping at this point we don't still need to do the business case for diversity, but it's always important to remember. And then this is not reflected in this graph here, but the report also looks at women's business ownership. And in 3 IORA countries, Kenya, Madagascar, and Thailand, the percentage of firms with women's participation in ownership exceeds 30%. Thailand is also the IORA member state with the highest percentage of firms with majority women's ownership and with the top woman manager, and was the country with the largest proportion of women-owned startups in 2015. So they're a real leader in the region. However, women are increasingly entering management and the boardroom, but the rate of progress is still pretty low. And many people in IORA member states surveyed in the World Values Survey, which we included in the report, actually supported the statement that when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. So there's still a lot of ideas and stereotypes around the breadwinner role within the family that really does impact women's participation in the economy. This is kind of just the last graph I wanted to show you. Laws protecting women in the workplace. Eliminating discriminatory laws and regulations is another crucial issue to overcoming gender-based discrimination and obstacles to economic independence. It's very important in order to create an enabling environment for women to access decent employment and entrepreneurship opportunities to really eliminate these gender discriminatory laws. So the report looked at these 3 areas of laws that are in front of you on the screen, in addition to many others. To better understand which countries still have these laws, you can see that 5 IORA countries actually lack legislation to prohibit discrimination in employment based on gender, for example. And I should mention in all of these slides that you've looked at, not all IORA member states are represented, and that is often due to lack of data. I also should mention that at the time of the report, we did not yet have the 23rd member state of IORA, which is France, which was a more recent addition. In 5 countries, in the screen in front of you, there's no legislation to protect against sexual harassment in the workplace. And in addition, we used the data from the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law. It revealed that 4 IORA countries still restrict women's legal capacity and ability to work, meaning that a husband can still prevent his wife from working, or a woman may need additional documentation to get a job. And in 5 countries, a woman cannot travel outside her home in the same way as a man, which is extremely restrictive in terms of women's mobility and options of pursuing employment. And just 7 governments in IORA countries paid for 100% of maternity leave benefits. And only 2 countries offer paid parental leave. So the report looks at maternity and paternity and parental leave as another issue, a resource to look at. So I know we're running out of time. I just kind of threw in a couple additional findings here. There's more women than men in informal employment. Women workers globally are more likely to be segregated in low paid work, such as jobs in the informal economy or part-time jobs. So of the 13 IORA countries with available data, women made up the greater proportion of informal workers in 10 countries. Levels of informal employment actually exceed 70% of the workforce in Bangladesh, Comoros, India, Indonesia, Madagascar, Mozambique, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and Yemen. So this indicates a real need to formalize employment first and foremost for both women and men, and focus these efforts on the sectors where informal work prevails, often where women are employed informally. Women are more likely to be employed in vulnerable employment in 18 out of 21 IORA countries. Vulnerable employment actually refers to contributing family workers and own account workers as defined by the ILO. People in vulnerable employment are less likely to receive benefits, Social Security, or representation by unions. And often informal in nature, these jobs are likely to have low productivity, low wages, and difficult working conditions. So these are real challenges for women in the workforce. And finally, women are more likely to have part-time employment in almost all of the countries with data. This allows them the flexibility to try and balance paid work and domestic and care responsibilities, but this also means they have little to no access to social protection coverage like maternity leave, sick leave, or pensions. On a positive note, I like to leave on a positive note, girls are staying in school longer and more women are entering tertiary education than men in most IORA countries. But comparably, if you look at this data on the screen, it shows that really more focus is needed on the school to work transition for young women if they're graduating at such high rates, but their participation in the labor force is so low. So basically, that's really just a small snapshot of some of the report's findings. It covers a lot of different issues, but I hope you'll read the rest of the report, or please check out the infographic if you're more of a visual person. The report includes a set of 15 recommendations. These are directed towards IORA member states and relevant stakeholders with the aim of creating an enabling legal and policy environment that's conducive for we in the region. And they focus basically, I'm not going to go through each recommendation, but they're focusing on strengthening gender mainstreaming, eliminating discriminatory laws, increasing the collection and use of sex disaggregated data, removing structural barriers to women's labor force participation, enacting gender responsive macroeconomic and labor market policies, eliminating gender discrimination in the workplace, extending social protection to all women, reducing and redistributing unpaid care and domestic work, like we discussed, ensuring access to quality and affordable health care, including sexual and reproductive health care, which we did not discuss, which is another important finding in the report, preventing violence and sexual harassment, basically at home, at work, and on the way to work, supporting young women's school to work transition. Sorry, I'm going through these so quickly, but we're short on time. Other recommendations focus on increasing women's digital and financial inclusion and literacy, promoting gender responsive procurement policies, and implementing the Women's Empowerment Principles, or the WEPs, among the private sector, as well as consulting women's organizations, women employers, and women workers on WE interventions. So on that note, I think I'm going to pass back to you, Kritika. Let's see if I can end the show here. And
thank you, Leigh. I'd like to highlight that you've already mentioned with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Even the limited gains made in the past decades are at risk of being rolled back. And it is therefore extremely important to undertake gender responsive policymaking, planning, and programming in the region. But on a personal note, it has been a great pleasure working with you over the last 3 years.
thank you, Kritika.
Well, now that we've heard about the report findings, let's turn to some observations from the region. First, I'd like to invite the Honorable Lujaina Mohsin Darwish, who is the Chairperson of the Infrastructure, Technology, Industrial, and Consumer Solutions Cluster at Mohsin Haider Darwish LLC. As a proud flag bearer of Omani Women Power, Honorable Lujaina has been a trailblazer in uplifting, empowering, and inspiring young Omani women entrepreneurs and corporate leaders alike. In 2015, she was appointed member of the State Council of the House by royal decree and is presently a member of the Esteemed Council. We are lucky to have her with us today. Over to you, Honorable Lujaina.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So, good morning, everyone. Respected dignitaries, esteemed members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Oman. I am greatly humbled as you provide me this great opportunity to speak before the August gathering on women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean Rim. The fact that I am standing here and addressing this forum is a testament to the empowerment that Omani women have enjoyed since the beginning of the Blessed Renaissance in 1970, under the visionary leadership of late His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said. The COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly posed enormous threats in all aspects of economy, but the weakest among all has been the reproductive health of women, followed by their financial standing as they were treated as expendable. Gender discrimination at workforce has led to numerous women losing their jobs. The triple disorder of childhood, childcare, unpaid domestic labor, harassment, and abuse in general, but specifically during this pandemic, has more than ever increased and burdened women with no place left to protest or complain. This is the forum which needs to understand and take care of their situation. As one of, as one of the women's empowerment principles, we need to continue to foster policies and practices promoting gender equality in both the formal and informal sectors. I would like to highlight that women have not been given a deserving involvement in the fight against COVID-19, as they have been excluded from committees entrusted with tackling the pandemic worldwide, the failure of multiple containment strategies in a direct result of such oversight. Governments need to include women in their fight against COVID, as women have been at the forefront of tackling the pandemic as healthcare workers, educators, and caregivers. Reducing barriers to women's economic participation is important for inclusive and sustainable economic growth. This can be achieved by larger gender inclusion across all walks of life, such as in the government, corporate sector, policy making, and strategic planning positions. The most important variables which constrain women's mobility and limit women's access to economic participation are culture and religion. The only solution to this is creating awareness through education, not only for women, but for men to accept women's intellect, value their composed thinking, and treat them in an equable manner. I call upon male counterparts to support women in leadership roles, business, politics, investment decisions, and in financial planning. I am pleased to share that Oman's thrust on educating women over the last 50 years has helped the country achieve an adult literacy rate of over 92%, according to the World Bank. This has helped in giving Omani women a better quality of life and furthered their professional success in no uncertain measure. We must accept the fact that despite the increase in women's labor force participation in 22 countries of IORA, there is still a decline in 7 countries, which is of major concern. Similarly, women empowerment in weakness as they make up a large proportion of part-time, low-quality. Oh, it's gone. Zoom meeting finished. Myself now, that's one. Sorry, I got cut off. I'm in again. You can hear me? Yeah. We must accept, sorry, we got cut off. We must accept the fact that despite the increase in women's labor force participation in 22 countries of IORA, there is still a decline in 7 countries, which is of major concern. Similarly, women employment is its weakness. They may make up a large proportion of part-time, low quality and low paid jobs. I strongly believe that with economic and financial freedom comes all other decision-making powers. Financial literacy plays a crucial role in economic empowerment. To create awareness, we must focus on empowering women through financial management, retirement planning, certificates, documentation, and investments in their own name with the requisite legal protection. Finally, political empowerment of women is an essential precondition for a change in laws, policies, and regulations. I can testify to this from my personal experience as a member of the State Council in Oman. As a political leader and entrepreneur, I believe that women as sentient beings went through the same change as men that brought us into this realization, but our intelligence is still underrated and our battle remains for the basics even today. The UN report on women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean Rim, Progress and Challenges validates with data the struggle of women. We must value and support our own gender to promote economic empowerment. I take this opportunity to strongly voice gender responsive policy making and planning. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to end with meaningful words from Lordre. Revolution is not a one-time event. Thank you and have a good day. And thank you very much. I would love to say I'm very honored to meet you all here today. Thank you for giving me this chance. And I would like to invite you all here to Oman to come and enjoy our Oman, and maybe we can take this topic further there. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Honorable Lujaina. We've actually been trying to lock you down as a speaker for IORA for quite some time now, and it's been well worth it.
Kritika, thank you very much for everything. I mean, I'm very honored to be among the very reputed people. I've heard about them a lot, and really, I'm and I'm very honored to be here today. Please take care, stay safe, and inshallah, we'll meet again.
Sure, will do. Now, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Mr. Marc Livsey. Marc is seconded to IORA from Australia to coordinate IORA's trade and women's economic empowerment work. He studied and worked in gender equality for many years and has been IORA's primary focal point for the UN Women project since 2018. Over to you, Marc.
Well, thank you, Kritika. Welcome, everyone. And thank you especially to the Honourable Lujaina. Not only have we been privileged to hear your personal experiences as a woman entrepreneur and leader, but I think we've identified once all the travel restrictions lift where we're headed next for our next Women's Economic Empowerment event in the region. Look, welcome to everyone. I see in the participant list many familiar names from the IORA community, business forum delegates, women's empowerment and working group delegates, government officials, but lots of new names as well. And we appreciate your time and encourage and commend this report to you to spread what you've heard about today and the rest of the wealth of data and information within your communities. That's part of the purpose of the webinar, to encourage a greater impact for this report. And so we appreciate your time. In the sake of time, I'll be brief and encourage you from now to start asking questions in the Q&A or the chat boxes, or you can, I believe you can raise hands as well. I won't dwell on, I had intended to say sort of where this report represents in terms of IORA's journey. I won't dwell on that because other speakers have touched on it. I'll jump straight into some observations about what this report tells us and what we can think about as a region, as an organisation that's committed to women's economic empowerment in the Indian Ocean region. What do we now know that we didn't know before, and what are we going to do about it? After the Q&A, I'll end with some observations on next steps moving forward and what the report might mean for IORA. So very, very quickly, the first thing, the report, it's been touched on by others, it's a real reminder of the incredible diversity in the region. Some of our member states have poverty rates near zero. Some have poverty rates at 60 to 70%. Some communities in our member states see almost everyone having bank accounts. And in other countries, only 60 to 70% have bank accounts. There are many other indicators. And you can see the obvious challenge in designing regional programs to provide support to entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and other women in these communities, is designing programs that will match the circumstances, the very wide range of circumstances that these people find themselves in. But at the same time, I'd like to emphasize it's a real blessing. It's a common refrain in IORA that our diversity is an asset for us. And I think that's particularly true in the case of women's economic empowerment. And the report is a real contribution in that regard. Some of the lessons that it's able to highlight, for example, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India's example of innovative cooperatives, the M-Pesa example in Kenya that's empowering women through mobile payments. Some of these are quite familiar to some of us already, but they're well worth emphasizing that there's still enormous scope to scale these examples up in those countries and in other countries around the region. And that's exactly what I think IORA can continue to leverage. It's that diversity and exchange between grassroots activists and advocates, as well as senior government officials and leaders. And I think that convening power is a real asset for us. The second observation I'd like to make is the real opportunity that the report highlights in entrepreneurship. For me, this is a meta focus of women's economic empowerment, because you can be entrepreneurial in any sector or in any piece of work that you might be undertaking. And that includes the specific sectors that the report mentions, as well as others. But particularly, I mean, on page 18, there is a very vibrant description of the region's entrepreneurial sector. And I take heart in that, not only because it demonstrates the assets that that women economic actors already represent, but also it aligns very, very closely to what IORA member states have identified as key priorities in the region. And that is promoting entrepreneurship, promoting the growth of small and medium enterprises. We know that they've been hard hit by COVID, and they need to be part of the economic response to the pandemic. While it is disappointing that labour force participation rates of women haven't really increased since 2010, it is the case that this entrepreneurial spirit is there to be harnessed, and I think it's a really key area for IORA as an association, for national associations, which many of you belong to, and also our member state governments to continue to focus on and redouble our efforts in. And just turning very, very briefly to recommendation 11, I think it very usefully steps out 3 specific elements of where we can focus our efforts. It's transitioning to work, as well as providing skills to women who are already in work. It's identified STEM as a particular sector where we have a huge amount of untapped potential. And it identifies mentoring and career advice as a particular avenue or modality to provide that support. And I think there's much to be made out of new technologies like this to connect women with new forms of support, such as longitudinal mentoring and career advice. If I had more time, I'd love to talk more about the specific sectors of fisheries and tourism. I think they're very usefully highlighted in the report. They're clearly central to IORA member state economies. There are very real barriers to women's participation in these sectors, but there are solutions to them. Also, we know that solutions to empowering women needs to be multifaceted, but these are 2 good places to start. There are several reports, good reports on fisheries recently. The first report launched by UN Women. There was a report also in 2019 by the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa that goes into some of the specific things we can do for women in fisheries. And that's going to be a continuing area of focus for IORA and I would hope our member states. In tourism, clearly, there's a dominance of the services sectors, including tourism, as a further untapped field for efforts to promote women's economic empowerment specifically. And there's great examples in the report from Kenya and South Africa in this regard, which I hope that we continue within IORA to explore. And I'm very heartened to see conversations continuing with organizations like the UN World Tourism Organization in that regard. And I'm excited to see what can happen on that moving forward. I'll stop there because I can see we've got 10 minutes left for questions and hand back to you, Kritika. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. From my own personal experience, it is not easy to facilitate regional cooperation, especially in the middle of a pandemic, but it's been a pleasure helping you deliver these activities and engage with women entrepreneurs from around the region. We will now move on to the Q&A session. People are welcome to either submit questions in the chat box or raise their hand for the Q&A. I see we do have a raised hand from Honorable Lujaina. Honorable Lujaina, would you like to say something? If not, I'll start taking questions. I see the first question we have is from Tilaka Chandrasena. Hello, the first question is, do you have any support for the small and medium enterprises, especially for women entrepreneurs? Marc, Leigh, would you like to respond?
Sure, Kritika, let me jump in and Leigh, welcome.
Yep.
Oh, Leigh, would you like to take it?
Go ahead, Marc.
Okay.
No, thanks. I was just asking a question of clarification about support. What kind of support the panelist, the person was asking about. But
yes.
Please go ahead.
If the panelist, if Tilaka would like to specify the kind of support, that would be welcome. In general terms, yes, as an association, IORA does provide support for women entrepreneurs, and it's mainly been delivered through the UN Women Partnership, which is why Leigh could have equally answered this question. And it's been primarily during the pandemic through webinars like this, designed to provide networking opportunities to other women entrepreneurs, to look at issues like how to run businesses, how might you adjust your business to COVID response. And off the back of a very successful set of those initiatives, which are all, as Kritika's outlined, detailed on the IORA website, we're very excited to be looking forward to an online conference in the coming months. Details will be confirmed, but it will be an online conference to welcome women entrepreneurs from around the region and provide them with some specific capacity building seminars and so on, as well as networking opportunities. So it's hard, and I must say, from a personal point of view, it's sometimes hard to penetrate within each IORA member state to the specific beneficiaries that we'd really like to target and that would benefit most from these activities. And we rely heavily on our member state governments to help us in that regard. But yes, please keep an eye out on the IORA IORA social media feeds and so on for initiatives. And if you'd like to engage further and propose regional initiatives, each member state has a national focal point, which is the main point of contact for people within our member states. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marc. I see a few questions in the Q&A box, so I'll just get to those. We have from Gareth Rees, IORA Secretariat, who said, thanks for the fascinating report. And he asked, are there any specific economic sectors that the report identifies as potentially making the largest impact on enhancing women's economic empowerment? Leigh, would you like to?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Gareth, for the question. So the report actually looks at the sector agriculture, services, and manufacturing. And the service sector is actually the largest contributor to GDP in many IORA countries. And so basically the tourism sector within services, the report highlights is a really rich area to promote women's economic empowerment. We recently supported a training on women's economic empowerment in the tourism sector, and the training and all the supporting material is going to be uploaded to the IORA website soon if you're interested in this topic and how to promote women's economic empowerment within the sector. Clearly having a lot of, well, all of the countries pretty much being on the ocean, tourism is a huge opportunity. Unfortunately, though, we still are seeing a lot of the same challenges as we see in other sectors, despite the fact that women actually make up the majority of employees in the sector. They tend to be in still the lower paid, less managerial positions, and still often in precarious work. So basically there's a range of employment and entrepreneurial opportunities, but many of the women who are entrepreneurs in tourism still lack access to capital to start their businesses. I mean, they face many of the same obstacles that we highlight throughout the report for women in most sectors. So the report does recommend, though, that tourism policy frameworks can be a really good place to start from the member state, from the government perspective. They can help to address some of these issues and remedy some of the gender inequalities, and also national development strategies is another opportunity to promote women's economic empowerment within the sector from a policy perspective. And the report also looks at manufacturing, taking into consideration that 60 to 90% of women are women in the clothing and food production. But again, this work can be very, very precarious, as we've seen in a lot of clothing manufacturing factories where the work is precarious and unsafe, it's informal. So this is also, once again, calling for efforts to promote decent work for women, not just employment, not just numbers, but actual decent work through gender responsive policies. That's kind of a quick answer, but yeah, I hope you'll look into the information that we'll be providing from the training on we in tourism.
Our next question is from Mr. Hugh Anderson. He asked how much of the IORA Social Development Program is focused on women's economic empowerment. Would you like to respond, Marc?
Thanks, Kritika, and thanks, Hugh. IORA in 2013 adopted women's economic empowerment as what's called a cross-cutting issue. And so what that means is we're trying to mainstream the objective of empowering women in everything we do. So you can say that it's a bit of both. There are specific initiatives focused on providing capacity building and research and networking and so on for that will in itself economically empower women. And we're also across the member states who are coordinating the different other sectoral interests of IORA, and of course in the Secretariat, attempting to weave in objectives that empower women in all of those different activities. Just as one specific example, we're quite pleased. I mean, just on agency, IORA is not a political organisation, but we acknowledge the need to empower women in our own activities, and so we are tracking now the participation of women attendees at our events and the speaking roles that are allocated to women against men, and that's just one way that the development program that IORA seeks to implement broadly is trying to really integrate the empowerment of women into everything it does. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. We'll just take one last question from Michael Kariuki, who asked, to what extent have IORA utilized ICT or digital technology to promote women economic empowerment? Marc, Leigh, would you like to respond?
Okay, I think that would be for you.
Yes, of course.
I mean, other than through our partnership and the webinars you just mentioned, that would be one way that we've utilized it.
That's right. My best example is the partnership with you, Leigh, and UN Women. So we're slow to the party, but we've gotten a lot better over the past 2 years. And this is an example. The standout example has been for me what was called a virtual cafe a few months ago. You can see it in our list of activities. It was a specific capacity building initiative implemented via Zoom by UN Women as part of this program. But it provided a very informal, relaxing space for women entrepreneurs to network with breakout rooms to address specific issues that entrepreneurs were facing, particularly young entrepreneurs. And then they came back together in a sort of plenary session. But it was a very safe environment, and it came up with some really sensible recommendations that are now on the website, which have literally come out of the voices of young women entrepreneurs in the Indian Ocean region that are being heard by governments and other stakeholders in the region. So we are not yet at the stage of using other more advanced platforms. I mean, I mentioned M-Pesa in Kenya. Those more hardware-oriented programs, perhaps, or even software, would require a different level of investment, and we'd certainly encourage those investments in our member states and led by our member states. And should there be an initiative at the regional level to share that kind of ICT empowerment via ICT avenues, we'd certainly be interested to be supporting it. For now, we're trying to leverage our convening power and that asset of bringing people together virtually across the region. So who knows, perhaps in a year or two, we'll see the next level of ICT familiarity and the ability to offer more services to women entrepreneurs. But for now, I think we're doing pretty well with this virtual networking modality. Thanks.
Marc, I might jump in here and talk a little bit about what Australia is planning to do with this online conference that you mentioned. It's something that Australia is leading on, and it's focused on building women entrepreneurs' capacity to deal with the pandemic. And as we virtually convene today, most women, like the rest of the world, are conducting business over virtual forms. So we're hoping in delivering this conference, we'll have seminars and information sessions on how to best utilise online platforms. It's an issue that we have to address given this pandemic. It's going to be an increasing means by which we do business. So therefore, women entrepreneurs who perhaps don't have access to the training and the facilities as large corporates do will need to tap into seminars such as the one that we're planning to host. And that in turn, we hope will begin the conversation about what tools we can deliver to them to help them do business in a virtual world. So I think, Marc, you're absolutely right. We're grappling with how we meet, but now we're getting to the stage where we're moving to how we can help the economic operators, particularly women entrepreneurs, in this space.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Marc. I know there are a few more questions, but I'm mindful of the time, and I do want to hand over to Marc for our closing remarks for today's session. So over to you, Marc.
Thank you very much, Kritika, and thank you again to all our panelists. Yes, there's quite a few questions we haven't been able to get to. We'll take a note and get back to each of you if we can with responses by email in the next day or two. So in closing, what does it all mean moving forward from here? Well, in the short term, we've got this webinar was timed as a sort of prelude to the next meeting of the Working Group of Women's Economic Empowerment in IORA, which is happening on Thursday. So that working group meeting will discuss the report, including its recommendations. And I noticed one of the questions from Lucy, thank you, Lucy, what resources might be available to support implementation of the recommendations? Well, those are the questions that the working group will consider. A lot of the recommendations are, of course, targeted at the national level, member state governments and women's empowerment agencies at the national level. But of course, there are things that IORA can do to support those agencies, share lessons, convene communities like this, and so on. And so resourcing will sort of be developed and sort of identified as we move forward, and in line with what the member states take away themselves from the report and its recommendations. And we also have to be mindful that we're in a very constrained environment. So member states' funding and attention has been severely disrupted by COVID. So we are looking to prioritize the one or two sort of flagship initiatives, and that's where this report will really help us to really focus in on what those are and how we go about doing them. But that doesn't mean, that's the short-term way forward. So that'll be considered by member states on Thursday. Catherine, thanks very much for your intervention. It's in the medium term, this report will be informing further initiatives like the conference you've mentioned. There's some other SME training that's on the horizon. We're looking at how we best take forward the community that's been established through the UN Women program, and the contacts that we've been able to generate through that. And this report will serve as an excellent sort of milestone in terms of taking this as a resource and specifically informing the agendas and the participation target audience of those future events that are in the pipeline, and encourage you all to stay up to date with the IORA social media and website accounts to see what they are. And of course, it goes without saying that in the long term, it's a very robust contribution to the data effort in the region. It's a data poor region in general. A large focus of IORA's efforts and Australia's efforts in this regard has been to fix that, so we know specifically where the efforts are going to be most impactful in the region. It's very accessible. Leigh, thank you for pointing out in particular the infographic. I think it's excellent, and it builds on a previously excellent infographic, and it's a very photogenic, easy way to spread the message about what needs to be done. And it's part of a suite of resources, as Kritika has mentioned, that is going to be on the IORA website into perpetuity, that is there for anyone to look up and to draw on at the international, regional or national levels when it comes to designing and implementing women's empowerment projects. So again, let me end with a genuine and heartfelt sense of appreciation to Leigh and UN Women for the efforts that have gone into the report and its precedent reports and activities. We also thank the Honourable Lujaina for her time. Sorry if there were connection issues there, and we look forward to seeing you in Oman. We thank DFAT, represented by Ms. Catherine Twomey today, a long-standing supporter of women's economic empowerment in IORA, and I'm sure that will continue, so thank you. Thank you to Critica for your excellent moderation of the session today. And once again, thank you to the main people, the group of people we need to thank, which are the participants, for giving up your time to learn a little bit more about IORA's contribution to efforts in this region. And we look forward to staying in touch with you as the journey continues. So thanks very much again, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.